We've been talking about your book. I think it would be great if you wouldn't mind reading a bit from the book. I have a suggestion, but we can cover this in a different way if you want to go with a different section. But I love the section "Standing Far Off." That's one of my favorite parts of the book, and it's about February. And there's a certain irony that you really make a lot of in that essay. That you have your insight about God's presence comes in the midst of the most isolated and desperate of times. Would you mind reading from that?
I'll read a bit.
Do you think there's a section that excerpts well, or would you just like to read from the beginning?
I think I'd read all the reasons why we stand far off. Because I think, I want to say this essay, before the book came into being, I would send out essays to various literary journals. This essay was picked up by 3 different journals. And you can actually, if you go to our website, you can find a link and find it online. It starts out, the shortest month of the year lasts forever. I don't know if anybody else feels that way about February. But I was just reflecting on that when I was driving here. I was like, how many more days? And actually this week has been pretty good. And it takes place, I was feeling pretty disconnected. February can do that to me. And I was doing my Lectio, and it was the little story of the Pharisee and the publican. I say, then one day for Lectio, I reread the parable of the Pharisee and the publican in Luke 18. I read aloud the familiar words, and for the first time hear this phrase, spoken of the publican, that public disgrace, standing far off. Standing far off. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Always before, I'd focused on the last part of that verse, but that morning 3 words pierced my heart, standing far off. What else had I been doing for the entire month of February but standing far off? Far off from God, far off from myself, far off from engagement with life. God's response, I tell you, this man went down to his home justified. Reading this, my heart opened and I wept. I was indeed standing far off, and yet God, who knows me well, said, it's okay. It still doesn't feel very good, and it continues to make my life challenging. But as far as God is concerned, it's okay. Standing far off may not feel comfortable, but God understands and remains close to me in infinite compassion. Though I stand far off, God does not. I'm going to skip a bit and go on to how we stand far off. How frequently do we all stand far off, and for so many different reasons? Like the publican, we're even unable to raise our eyes or thoughts or heart. We stand far off in guilt over all the miserable things we've done or not done. Surely God knows our horrible sins and failings. We live in terror of condemnation. How could we dare approach the Holy One? We stand far off in unworthiness. Perhaps we think we're too sinful. Or perhaps we know we could never live up to the standard of perfection we think God has set for us. Never mind that it's we who have set it for ourselves. Never mind that it's unattainable, too high for any human being ever to reach. Nevertheless, we believe ourselves unworthy, and we stand far off, cringing in a corner, our heads bowed to earth, able only to look at our unlovely imperfection. Perhaps we stand far off because we're afraid. After all, don't we know that God will judge us? Who can possibly stand before God's face unafraid? we read, "It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God," and we forget the story of the good thief forgiven on the cross. Or else we think the thief was in some way different from us, better than us, more open to God's love than we are. We stand far off, abiding in fear. We stand far off because we feel dry, arid, and unmoved. The things of God are outside our hearts, unable to enter, and we feel we must be pushing God away. Surely this must be my fault. Surely if I only tried harder, did something different. So we think, and yet we're unable, and we turn away and stand far, far off. We stand far off because we're anxious. God may not really be the loving and compassionate one of whom we've heard others speak, and there are so many other anxieties as well. How will I pay the bills today? And will my children have the courage to turn away from peers who push them towards drugs and alcohol? Will that sick parent or spouse really get better? Will there be enough money for retirement? What will I do when I grow old? Who will take care of me? Can I really trust God with all these worries? It seems so unbelievable to think that God could care for me. It really is all up to me, isn't it? How can I ever go close to God with all this on my mind? We stand far off from God, but we stand very, very close to all our worries and anxieties. We stand far off, and sometimes we just don't know why. Or we may not know how to move toward God. Perhaps we feel stuck, paralyzed. We stand far off because we feel ashamed. Perhaps we've done something we feel is too awful to talk about. It might not even be something all that important, but it's horribly important to us. We're ashamed because we eat too much or we talk too much. And the greatest shame of all, we don't look good enough. Shame is so deeply connected to our bodies and our looks, to our posture, to our stance in the world. We're very much ashamed, and so we hang back, hoping to be unseen, standing far off. We hang back and stand far off when we feel abandoned. Perhaps the deepest fear, the deepest shame, and the deepest anxiety is about abandonment. Why would anyone ever love us or care for us or watch over us when we're so unlovable? Impossible. We've experienced this many times before in our lives, haven't we? Parents and siblings let us down just when we most needed them. Friends betrayed us. The world turned its back. Besides, we'd rather sit in our bleak, dark isolation. We may be miserable. We may feel dead, as though we're turned to stone. But at least it's familiar. It's not risky or challenging. It doesn't hold out any false hopes. And so we stand far, far off in our abandonment and isolation.
You're right. In that piece and in the whole book, you really are writing about the feeling of abandonment, but you end up talking about hope and God's presence. That's the beautiful irony that I saw in that essay, but that really carries on through the whole book. That's a way I think this particular chapter, this essay, is such it's such a standard bearer for the whole book. It really captures one of the main themes of the book.
Well, if you read the gospel, if you pray with the scriptures, it's about hope. The Pope just had an encyclical, The Joy of the Gospel. I mean, it's about hope. Mm-hmm. It's the gospel, the good news. And what brought me out of that standing far off, I end it. Standing far off, I remain in the desert this February. I call upon the living one and remind myself that God is always standing close at hand. That's where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and I mean, that's why I'm a fervent advocate of reading the scriptures and praying the scriptures. And that means Lectio, really. Because sooner or later, that'll take hold of us, you know. You know, we may feel like we're standing far off. We may feel, I talk about anger, I talk about sadness, I talk about all kinds of negative emotions, which we all have from time to time. And sooner or later, if you're really praying the scriptures, you find your way through them. God finds your way through them.
I wonder if anybody else has a question or a comment they'd like to make before we wrap up.